So thank you everyone for joining us. This is actually our first online author meets critics sponsored by the Society for Philosophy of Emotion. And today we are going to have a author meets critic with Tom Digby on his book Love and War. And so Tom is emeritus professor of philosophy at Springfield College and writes lectures and teaches about gender. His most recent book is Love and War, How Militarism Shaped Sexuality and Romance by Columbia University Press, which won the 2017 Choice Academic Title Award. His previous book is Men Doing Feminism by Routledge, and he has written numerous articles for philosophy journals and other publications. His multimedia lectures have been enthusiastically received by audiences in North America and Europe. So we're going to start out, we have 5 speakers, or critics, and then we will have a short break, and then we'll have Tom's response, and then an open Q&A with the entire panel. And if Tom, you'd like to start us off with a little synopsis of your book, that would be great.
Oh, okay. I'm assuming most people have read the abstract that you posted, Cecilea, so I'll just say a couple of short things. One is that I noticed that everybody who reads my book finds it full of arguments. And in fact, I worked really hard to make sure that there would be no arguments in the book. And, my background is in phenomenology, which may not mean anything to anyone here. I'm not sure, but my philosophical work is descriptive. So what I mean to be doing is describing how militaristic culture works. So it's kind of a pragmatic phenomenology, and it's a description in the sense that I use the bird watching analogy. If you're out watching birds, which I've never actually done, I'm just imagining this is how it works, and you see a really cool bird, you point it out and to the person you're with, your companion, and if that person can't see it, that person doesn't say, you're wrong, there's no bird. You say, well, it's actually, see that branch, that long branch with has one red leaf on it or something like that. You try to give little clues to help them see it, and ultimately either they see the bird or they don't, but there's no disagreement about whether the bird was there. Your friend assumes that you saw the bird, and with time it may happen that the person sees it. So it's kind of like that. Doing phenomenology as a philosopher, and the book started with me. It started with me wanting to understand love, and then eventually I realized that all these other factors are involved, and that in fact there are maybe 4 elements that are involved. One is the gender binary. A second is masculinity, which is part of the gender binary, or I would say 6/gender binary. And another is misogyny, and the other is militarism. And the way I stumbled upon this was by looking at anthropologists, actually. When I started out, I was being encouraged I was in a women's studies program at a small college, and I would teach courses like Women in Power, very assertive, aggressive, feminist courses. And my friends in the program said, I was the only male. My friends said, Tom, what we really need for you to do is teach courses on masculinity and on men, to relate to the men on campus and so on. And I was a little depressed about that, but I started studying it, looking into it, and I found that philosophers don't write about masculinity, or at least they didn't then, which was 25, 30 years ago, and they still aren't very much, actually. When Graham Parsons, who was going to be on this panel, but he's at West Point, the United States Military Academy, and he had to withdraw because of Trump's visit to West Point that interfered with his preparations for this panel. But he will be in the writing something for the special issue of the journal or book, however it winds up being. Graham asked me one time, just within the last few months, who else writes about masculinity in philosophy? And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I really couldn't think of anyone. Now that doesn't mean there is no one, but it seems to be not very common. So I took that on that task, but it turns out that anthropologists do write a lot about masculinity. And so I studied anthropology extensively, and I was already interested in cross-cultural studies. And so, and what I found was there are societies that don't have any of these factors, that have no gender binary. Hold my hand up here. That have no gender binary, that have don't have masculinity, which is of course associated with the gender binary, don't have misogyny, and don't have militarism. And those societies tend to be the same societies with different mixtures and so on, but those there seems to be a pattern of those things fitting together. So that's how the book started off, was with those insights drawn from anthropology. So, but basically, you know the outline of the book, that I start out trying to understand the antipathy between men and women, the battle of the sexes, as it's sometimes called, and I came to realize it had a lot to do with masculinity, more with masculinity than with femininity, which has its own issues and problems and so on. But I should stop at this point and go ahead, because most of you are already familiar with this anyway.
So let's just move on with the first comment, and then Tom could join us when he's ready. So our first critic is Don Floyd, and Don is with the University of Lenoir-Rhyne University, North Carolina. She is Director of Compliance, Title IX coordinator, and an adjunct professor. She is licensed to practice law in New York and North Carolina, and worked as a litigator for 10 years before moving into higher education. Her work centers on higher education law and compliance, including implementing and ensuring compliance with various regulatory laws in the higher education setting, and conducting complex civil rights.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure. Something happened to my internet connection, which never happens. But
no worries. I just introduced Dawn, so Dawn is going to give her comment, and then we'll move on to the next commentators, and then we'll have a little break.
Okay. Great. Hi, Dawn.
Hi. So I want to start out just by saying thank you to the Society for Philosophy of Emotion, to Cecilea, who has organized this, to Tom Digby for writing a great book that we get to talk about today, and to all the other critics who are here, including my close colleague, Michael Deckard, who is also from Lenoir-Rhyne University. I really appreciate the opportunity to engage in these issues, and specifically in the context of Tom's great book, Love and War. So my colleague, Michael Deckard, and I use Tom's book, Love and War, in a class that we teach here at Lenoir-Rhyne University. The class is called Love and War. It wasn't named after Tom's book. They just happen to share the same name, but it's a year-long first-year seminar class. And our students really like the book. Although they may not agree with everything Tom says in the book, they do and have shared with us that they find the book enlightening and thought-provoking, well-reasoned, and very easy to read. And so it is a very popular book with their class, and we do use other books for the class. Tom graciously gives us a little bit of time every spring to talk to our students, and we really appreciate that. So in addition to teaching, I'm also the university's Title IX coordinator, and as Cecilea said, I'm also an attorney. And in my role as the university's Title IX coordinator, I receive complaints every day regarding sex and gender-based discrimination and violence. And I feel like in this role, I bear witness on a daily basis to the battle of the sexes and the heterosexual antagonism that Tom talks a lot about in the book. In my role, it's really important as a Title IX coordinator that I'm fair and impartial, and that I uphold the rights of all of the folks who come to my office. My focus today, and I think this because is unique to my background, is less on some of the theories that Tom has in the book, and focuses more on that I do not share the same hope that Tom does, that our society is progressing in the issue of the battle of the sexes, and reducing heterosexual antagonism. And I think that probably has a lot to do with what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I have two primary reasons that I'll talk about today why I think actually we've regressed as a society since this book was published in 2014, despite some wonderful movements like Me Too, Time's Up, No More. My first argument is that since the book came out in 2014, misogyny and harassment and violence has not declined. It is not on the decline at all. And my second reason, and the one that I'll spend the most time talking to, my second reason I believe our society is actually regressing a little bit is that I think more than ever, those who are speaking out about their experiences of misogyny, harassment, discrimination, violence, sexual and relationship violence are actually being retaliated against, punished, threatened, and intimidated more than ever, which is not creating a space where people feel like they can be comfortable coming out with what's happening to them, and it doesn't give our society a place to actually have the kinds of conversations that we need to have. So I want to focus first on the idea that our society has not improved since 2014, despite some cultural movements, because I don't think that incidents of harassment and violence have declined since 2014. So according to Tom, the warrior ideals that he talks about in the book of a militaristic culture like what we have in the US requires our men to be emotionally tough and to suspend their capacity to care about the suffering of others. And he goes on to say that in war-reliant cultures, the faith in masculine force is so pervasive and so far-reaching that it leads to sweeping patterns of domination by men, not only in domestic life, but in realms of politics, economics, religion, and popular culture. And then he also says, from an earlier work in his career, that US society, institutionally and culturally, make men's violence against women a viable strategy for many men. And Tom gives a lot of examples of this in his book, and I'll talk about a couple of them. In one example, Tom refers to a New York Times article written by Frank Bruni, where Bruni is arguing about the stamina of misogyny and sexism. And he talks about sexual assault in the military and reveals that in 2012 alone, there were 26,000 military members sexually assaulted. That is something that hasn't gone away, and it doesn't seem to have gotten any better than in 2014 when Tom talked about those numbers. In fact, a new survey of active duty troops has found that even though after 2012 the numbers of sexual assaults in the military dropped, they are now on the rise again and have risen 38% from 2016 to 2018. And in 2018 alone, 20,500 service members experienced sexual assault. Tom also talks in the book about Sergeant Erin Edwards. She was shot and killed on July 22nd, 2014 by her husband, who then shot and killed himself. And the New York Times has reported recently, in April of last year, that domestic homicides, like what Sergeant Erin Andrews experienced, are on the rise again after 4 decades of decline. In fact, the number of victims of domestic homicide rose 19% between 2014 and 2017, Also are numbers of incidents of harassment and discrimination that are being experienced by our youth, folks who are under 18, our college students, and our employees who are in workplaces all over the country. The numbers there are astounding as well. 22% of adult females and 15% of adult males report that they experience some form of partner violence between the ages of 11 and 17. According to the National Institute of Justice, 44% of all reported sexual assaults happen to someone under the age of 18. And for our college students, 19% of women and 6.1% of men have been a victim of at least one completed or attempted sexual assault since entering college. And in our workplaces, the EEOC is reporting increases in charges of sex discrimination and reached a height of 32.4% of their charges in 2019. So despite the fact that women and men all over the country and really all over the world are saying, you know, Me Too, time's up and no more, and though it is helpful that these voices are being raised to the national and international stage, we haven't really changed our ideals around masculinity, and these ideas haven't evolved in any way. And so I think, as the statistics show, these types of incidents of sexual and relationship violence, sexual harassment, if anything, have probably worsened since 2014. So I want to move now and focus on my second argument, or my second idea, which is that I'm not sure I have as much hope as Tom does about where we are as a society on these issues. So Tom talked a little bit at the beginning about the idea that there are a lot of cultures that do have or that do not have these ideals of male domination and female subordination. And the success of those cultures can give us hope. He also talks about some other indicators in the book of being hopeful that we're starting to grapple with some of these issues related to gender. One is that we seem to be changing our attitudes a bit about women in combat and becoming more accepting of that. We seem to be more accepting of the fact that women in some families are becoming more of the provider as more women go back to work and start to have greater earning power. And also that men may no longer be needed to procreate, because now we have in vitro fertilization. But as Tom points out, some men just aren't handling all of this well. He says, while the grip on women's lives of the cultural programming of male domination and female subordination is loosening, the men are clinging to it ever more tightly. So one of the things I want to focus on is what can happen to survivors or victims who experience forms of sex harassment and discrimination in the workplace, or sexual harassment, sexual assault, or sex discrimination in the workplace. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is responsible for enforcing the laws that make it illegal to discriminate against someone based on a protected status like race, color, religion, sex. It also makes it illegal to retaliate against someone who makes a report of sex discrimination or race discrimination, or someone who participates in an investigation. So the word retaliation, it does have an ordinary meaning. It means to harm someone because they harmed you. Some people may call it revenge, but under our laws, it has a specific meaning. Retaliation means that you have received unfair treatment because you complained about discrimination at your job. And one of the things that I find interesting is that the EEOC is reporting in 2019 that 53.8% of all of the charges that it receives are of retaliation. And the point is that the largest number of complaints being received by the EEOC is from people who are claiming that they received unfair treatment because they exercised their right to report discrimination or harassment. So the numbers of charges of retaliation are greater than the numbers of charges based on the underlying discrimination. And these are just everyday people who are going to work and either experiencing or witnessing discrimination and being retaliated against because they are now speaking up and saying, you know, I am being discriminated against. As a Title IX coordinator, I hear regularly from students, faculty, and staff that they are very fearful of reporting sexual harassment and discrimination because they fear retaliation from their social group, their colleagues, university administrators, and professors. But if your alleged perpetrator is someone who is rich or famous, literally, they can destroy your life. So some of you are probably familiar with Harvey Weinstein, who in February of 2020 was found guilty of criminal sexual assault in the 1st degree and rape in the 3rd degree. He threatened to kill his employees and their families if they didn't provide cover for his illegal and abusive behavior. He used spies to track his victims, and he hired private security agencies to collect information on the women. And it wasn't just his victims that he went after. He went after reporters who did investigative journalism around what these victims and survivors were reporting. And Ronan Farrow wrote a book about it called Catch and Kill. And he talks in there about how he had to take extraordinary measures to protect his own health and safety and to protect the integrity of his work. Another example is Susan Fowler, who just released a book called Whistleblower, My Journey to Silicon Valley and Fight for Justice at Uber. She chronicles how she experienced a toxic workplace at Uber, and that when she reported sexual harassment at Uber by one of her male colleagues, she found herself being the one subject to investigation, being demoted, being given lower performance evaluations, and being gaslighted into believing that she was the problem just because she reported something rather than the person that she reported who allegedly sexually harassed her. She talks in her book about making her allegations public in a blog post, and she talks about the thousands of responses that she got from people everywhere reporting to her that they had experienced the same kind of retaliation and fear and intimidation that she had experienced just because they reported the offensive behavior. So Tom tells us that men are raised to be warriors in our current culture, which requires them to suspend their caring. And they are taught male domination, and that they must therefore control and quiet the women and the men who are reporting their bad behavior. And through some of the examples I gave, we see that they will do anything to maintain their relationship to power, including mental and physical harm of people who report their behavior, reputational harm, and really the list goes on and on. There are really far too many types of retaliation, intimidation, and revenge than we can list here. I want to be hopeful like Tom is in his book. I do see a lot of positive changes in our culture. I see a national dialogue around what it looks like to be a healthy male. There's a lot of national dialogue around the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement. There are a lot of things raising these issues to the national and international stage. I think our representative democracy is starting to look more like our culture. We have more people of color and more women in power. But I think until we create a society where people feel safe to report offensive behavior and have their concerns addressed fairly without intimidation, retaliation, and fear, that we're going to remain stuck in this battle of the sexes. And so in closing, I would ask Tom whether he thinks we've made any progress in the battle of the sexes since 2014 when the book was published. And if so, what are those? If not, what can we do? And then what can we do to combat retaliation against people that speak out about harassment and violence, which seeks to silence them? Thank you.
So Shira is professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and an unconventional feminist redefining gender justice. A nationally recognized expert on sexual politics and contemporary culture, her newest books are The Pornography Industry, What Everyone Needs to Know by Oxford University Press, Gender, Sex, and Politics by Routledge, and New Views on Pornography by Fraser. Her books also include Men and Feminism by Steel Press, Fashion Talks, Undressing the Power of Style by SUNY Press, When Sex Became Gender by Routledge, and Men Speak Out, Views on Gender, Sex, and Power by Routledge. She developed and regularly teaches a course on masculinity in which she incorporates Tom Digby's book, Love and War. She is currently a fellow with the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement.
Thank you. John, thank you also for starting this off and opening the conversation. I want to say thank you for inviting me to participate. That's for Tom and for Cecilea. I was a huge academic fan of Tom's work before he and I ever talked, and so I'm thrilled to participate in this. Following on the theme of hope that Don introduced, I agree it's difficult to feel hopeful, but I also feel that I couldn't do the work that I do if I didn't feel like things could change in a positive way. And so I'll start with that, and I'll also say that Tom's point in his book about hope is always an exam question for my students. And I think that's particularly important, even if it's not perfect and it's still challenging, that when I'm teaching, that my students have a sense of how things might change in a sense of agency, and that we can participate in that positive change. Otherwise, we can critique. There's plenty to critique, and it's I think that hopefulness is a positive, important point. That said, I'm not going to start on a hopeful point in my comments, but although I'm getting there at the end. So just to summarize and recap what Tom is doing, and I'll be brief in my comments. In his book, Love and War, Tom Digby expertly reveals the dimensions of sexism that are embedded in militarized and hegemonic masculinity. And although he doesn't directly address this in his book, Tom's philosophical foundations help to articulate how militarized masculinity is inherently a racist masculinity. And so my engagement, my conversation here builds on those foundations to engage with the issue of police violence towards Black communities, which is important, especially at this moment. Tom ends his book on an optimistic note for the future, and this egalitarian, what I like to call his egalitarian hopefulness, invites structural and cultural change that, while not directly addressed in his book, are suggested by it. So his thesis involves many things. Three things that I want to highlight is where he says that militaristic societies establish values and goals that require men to do three things. Number one, to cut off their feelings of care for others and for themselves. Number two, to see women's freedom as a threat. And three, to rely on violence to solve problems. And as it currently exists in US police practices, all three boxes are checked in that. This has obvious personal and political impact on communities of color and Black lives. And we've been painfully hearing about this for centuries, and we're hearing this loudly right now as we have this conversation in 2020 America. So hegemony and upholding militaristic societies requires a show of force and power over groups of people who are subordinated and subjugated. This subjugation, domination, and socio-political control is enacted on women's bodies, as Tom writes about in his various examples and chapters. This abuse of power is also enacted on Black bodies, on trans bodies, on queer bodies, and on the bodies of poor people. And to the point that I want to make, the subjugation and social control through violence, or even the threat of violence, is enacted directly by police onto Black bodies. So again, in Love and War, Tom isn't writing about racism and police violence because that is not the point of his book, but he could be writing about that. And so my critique or my comments are not, he should have written a different book, but to say that the foundations that he laid out are so important in terms of drawing from those really strong building blocks to enable us to see very deeply the dynamics of police violence, masculinized police violence, and the built-in racism. So Tom writes about militarism and masculinity. The police are highly militarized. So in order to connect the dots, according to Tom's explanation, hegemonic masculinity operates through the following steps. First, militarism puts faith in masculine force to solve problems. Sounds like the police. Number two, second, this militarization is carried out by men, but it's not only carried out by men. What Tom is, I think, inherently discussing or describing is he's writing about men as men, but also writing about a masculinist mode of thinking and being in terms of structures of domination, or the matrix of domination, being very masculinist. So militarization in that view is internalized by all of us, by all members of war-reliant societies, and we all live in a war-reliant society. And that second point explains how we are all complicit in this deep cultural programming that Tom describes, whether or not we ever wear a uniform, whether or not we ever hold a gun, and even when we adamantly think of ourselves as non-racist or egalitarian. The third dot to connect is that militarism supports a set of values that glorifies those people who display forceful behavior. Doing this requires that militaristic society presumes the chronic existence of adversaries. Again, Tom writes about this in terms of the battle of the sexes, but clearly this pertains to police practices. Militaristic society obscures opportunities for collaboration and cooperation as a mode of being, and instead, militaristic society bakes in a paranoid presumption of enmity toward others, and I'm saying others, capital O. This third point, this militarized paranoia and the abuse of power, is how police shoot Black men like Rayshard Brooks in the back 2 times. This militarized paranoia and abuse of power is how police murdered George Floyd. Yet, if Tom does not directly write about police violence and Black lives, how can his work be expanded to include these issues? Here's one suggestion that I want to put on the table. Raewyn Connell is an Australian sociologist and author of many things, including The Social Organization of Masculinity, and the following points that I'm making draw from that work. Connell argues that hegemonic masculinity requires not only the subordination of women by men, and also the subordination of some forms of masculinities, plural, but it also hinges importantly on domestic and global gender regimes that hinge on racialized discourse that marginalizes both men of color and men of the global South. Connell says a structure of inequality on this scale is hard to imagine without violence to enforce it. The reason violence is required is because it's not actually legitimate power or authority, and the only way that can be maintained, therefore, is through threat of violence or violence. In a system of militarized hegemonic masculinity, which we live in, massive inequalities and dispossession of social resources, such as money, wages, wealth, property, and basic safety and bodily integrity, are all directly tied to these threats of violence or actual violence in order to keep this inequality intact. This hegemony is reinforced daily vis-a-vis police violence. So bringing this, that's Connell, and bringing this back to Tom's book, which is titled Love and War, raises 2 questions that I want to put on the table. One question is about war, and one question is about love. So question number one, how is current policing engaging in a war against the people? Well, warfare requires armament. The police are heavily armed. Some examples include night vision goggles, machine guns, armored vehicles, bayonets, grenade launchers, military aircraft. Where does that gear come from? It's equipment directly from the Department of Defense that would have otherwise been destroyed. How does that work? This transfer of armament is possible to the DoD's 1033 program that went into effect in the early 1990s. Since that time, law enforcement has accessed more than $6 billion of military equipment. In May 2015, President Obama issued Presidential Order 13688 that limited or restricted law enforcement agencies' participation in the DoD's 1033 program. So by that order, some of that weaponry that I just listed is ostensibly disallowed. However, that was in 2015. Fast forward then to August 2017, when Donald Trump revoked Obama's executive order. According to the Defense Logistics Agency, which is billed as, quote, the nation's combat logistics support, as of June 2020, there are around 8,200 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies from 49 states and 4 US territories that are still participating in the 1033 program. Something that goes beyond sort of the time that we have right now, but that I want to put on the table as well, is the way that this infuses our schools, our public schools, and especially schools in communities of color, and militarizing those school campuses. Along with the hardware, you know, like night vision goggles and heavy duty guns that infuse police departments, there has also been a simultaneous shift to increased use of military tactics, such as SWAT teams and no-knock raids, the kind that killed Breonna Taylor when the Louisville, Kentucky police stormed through her door and killed Breonna while she was sleeping in her bed in March 2020. These tactics and weapons were used in Ferguson, Missouri, and Charlotte, North Carolina, and currently at Black Lives Matter anti-racist protests currently happening across the country and across the world in 2020. One study found that paramilitary-style police teams increased by more than 1,400% since 1980. So I'll pause that data there, and that all pertains to my question number one about war. My question number two is about love, and I think all of what I've just said is quite sobering, and that's not where I want this story to end, even in my telling, but for our world. And instead, I am ending on a second question, which, like Tom's book, introduces a more hopeful and optimistic outcome. Given our militarized society, which folds in intersectional factors of racism, sexism, hegemonic masculinity, and the abuse of power, the question for me then becomes, what is the way out of these problems? How do we show, specifically, how do we show love for our neighbors and communities? Tom explains that militarized society or war-reliant societies involve such deep cultural programming that these core elements, these beliefs, values, and dispositions are so deeply ingrained and reinforced that they are rarely subjected to sustained doubt or critical examination. And that point, I think, is very important. Tom says this deeply ingrained programming is rarely subjected to critical examination, but he doesn't say never. And I think there is where we can find a small crack or a small fissure in the stronghold of cultural militarism, sexism, and racism. And it is that small crack in that stronghold that the people are maximizing right now in demands for structural change. So doubt and critical examination might be rare in Tom's words, but it is currently very loud. It's the protest that's filling our streets right now and will hopefully, I hope, fill the law books of the future. And my final thought is this, that Tom Digby's book, Love and War, helps reveal the embedded daily war that impacts sexuality, romance, and human relations. His book also helps reveal what built-in structural love might look like too. And that's the hopeful note that he ends on and that I would like to end on as well. So thank you, Tom, for writing this book.
Our next speaker is Michael Mascolo. He is a professor of psychology at Merrimack College. His work is devoted to creating a relational developmental framework for understanding human development. He has written widely on issues related to human development, self, emotion, education, social relations, and conflict resolution. His latest project is Creating Common Ground, creatingcommonground.org, an online magazine and interactive platform devoted to bridging divides on contentious social and political issues.
Okay, so my name is Mike Mascolo. I am delighted to be a part of this panel. Thank you, Cecilea, for organizing this. Thank you, Tom Digby, for writing this wonderful book. I have found it to be very enlightening. I want to talk about the relational construction of gender and sexuality. I'll be taking this from perhaps a slightly different frame of reference. So next slide, please. Okay, what I appreciate about this book, okay, we're going to do a lot of this, Cecilea. So I'll go slide, press. First, the thing that I appreciated was the idea that conceptions of masculinity are at the center of many problems of gender relations. This really came out to me in a big way, the importance of masculinities. And that such masculinities are structured by a warrior mentality in which masculine identities are organized around toughness, protection, and a warrior type of mindset. I found that to be a valuable notion. Next. Sadly, there's an awful lot of cretinism still in our culture, it seems to be, and he has articulated that in a deep way, and it's very sad. Next. Now, what I want to suggest, one, go ahead. Gender roles, in my view, are not simply culturally programmed. I want to argue for a more complex notion of gender and gender development that has its origins in modern conceptions of epigenetic development and historical anthropology. Next, please. In my view, I worry about how the discourse, and particularly the political discourse on gender, is working or not working in the ways that have already been talked about. And I fear that, for example, concepts like misogyny are not helpful in promoting that discussion. For me, the concept of misogyny is sometimes misplaced. For me to understand immoral masculinities, I think we need to look at male psychology, masculine identities, and particularly masculine sexuality and the way it may differ from female sexuality. Next, please. To cultivate moral masculinities, I think we need to acknowledge rather than explain away biologically influenced sex differences, more specifically epigenetically developed sex differences. And we need alternative conceptions of masculinity that, in my view, transcend ideological divides. Next, please. Okay, first and foremost, sex or gender roles. They're very complex. As anything, what we understand today is that development, human development, animal development, what have you, is epigenetic. Now, what does that mean? It means that genes and biology on the one hand and culture and social relations on the other hand are inseparable as causal factors in development. You cannot extract, you cannot divide development into a cultural something and a genetic something. They mutually influence each other. So this slide, you see that from biology, biological processes influence action, which influences social relations, which influences culture, and that feeds back and influences social relations and action and biology. It's a fully coactive thing. Next slide, please. And therefore, I think we can't simply say that gender roles are culturally programmed. We have to look at it's one layer of the process, and a very important layer, but one layer itself. Next, please. Here are some examples of some sex-related epigenetic biases that people bring with them as groups, if you will. These are group differences. So XX and XY individuals are biologically biased toward different outcomes. For example, next. Physical strength, this is obvious. Okay. Now, if in the new edition of my slides here, I had a gradient across here. There always must be a gradient. It always must see that any difference that we're talking about is gender related, but not gender specific. There is tremendous overlap. These are group differences. Nonetheless, they exist. A bias toward, an epigenetic bias toward physical strength in men, and obviously childbirth, breastfeeding, menstruation in women. Next, please. There are epigenetic biases in the development of spatial and verbal skills. You can begin to see differences in spatial skills by 4 months of age. Next, please. Sexual anonymity. XY individuals tend to, across the globe, prefer more sexual anonymity, more sexual promiscuity, and women across the globe, there is a tendency toward more sexual exclusivity. Next, please. Aggression and empathy. It's enormous. It's an enormous difference. Next, please. And there is, as we hear these days, much more of a bias toward at least men interested in things, whereas women are more interested in people, etc. These are epigenetic biases. They are not deterministic. Next, please. So what about gender roles? Gender roles emerge through biomaterial, technological, cultural relations. You've got to look at the relation between biology, the material conditions of the time, the technological conditions of the time, and the cultural conditions of the time. This is very, very important, in my opinion, because when we have this distinction here, quite often, in my view, where we're talking about femininity as one way, or women in one hand and men on the other, being either inherently dominating or culturally dominating. I want to argue that that is not necessarily the case. Next slide, please. So if we start off, next, please. If we start off with these epigenetic biases, XXXY, you have to look at the culture. Digby, Tom Digby had a suite of examples of societies which were more egalitarian. And what we find is that in hunter-gatherer societies, we see a great degree of egalitarianness. Men and women are on the move together. They are catching game, they're gathering, and we have minimal amount of distinction. Well, we've got breastfeeding, and that's going to cause something. And then you've got the physical strength, which is going to lead toward males more likely to practice and look for large game, engage in protective types of activities. Note that it's linked to the cultural and relational conditions of the time. Next, please. As we go forward into agrarian society, we see that the amount of gender differentiation is gender commonality is decreasing. We're getting more distinctions, a sedentary lifestyle. We've got kids in one place more often. We've got a plow. The men's upper body strength is more likely to be able to use that plow. The next two, please. Under feudalism and capitalism, we get a much clearer differentiation of the public and the private sphere. In the public sphere, we have the power structures that exist that come right from business. And of course, we have war. Next, please. And what we're having now in late capitalism, press please, is we've got massive technological changes. Back please in one. Massive technological changes. We've got increased emphasis on rights. We have birth control. We have increased technologies, and these technologies are freeing up these relations in ways that are unprecedented, and are allowing for a restructuring of power structure in the public and private spheres. Next, please. So gender roles come not from culture, not from biology, but from a complex relation of the relation between the biological and material and technological conditions of the time. Now, that's an important idea to me, because for me, much of the discourse that we are talking about with respect to male versus women and the tensions tends to cast men in a certain way that shames them, that defames them and blames them, if you will. All three of those things in the context of gender relations. Now, men are doing some pretty horrible things. Now, we know this. The question is, how do we solve it, in my view? And I worry that many of the types of things, for example, that Dawn and Shira talked about earlier, may in fact be increasing because we're taking a more combative and adversarial way of addressing these issues, a blaming and shaming and cancel culture type of a way, rather than a more constructive, engaging way in which we're going to try to understand the psychological processes of each person involved in the dichotomy. So I think that example of this would be the concept of misogyny. Let's go to the next slide, please. Keep going, please. Skip over this, please. Skip over this. Next. Keep going. I want to skip the whole thing. Okay, gender biases and sexuality. Epigenetic biases in the development of sexuality. They are pervasive and I think overwhelming. Next slide. Next, please. So one is that consistent with the stereotypes. There's plenty of data out there suggests, at least in the West, at least amongst young people, thoughts and urge of males are thinking about sex more often, and they have a more immediate desire for sex than females do, self-reported females. Next, please. The objects of desire, the men seek release, orgasm. They want to please their partner, whereas females are more likely to report desiring intimacy, emotional closeness, love, and feeling desirable. Next, please. Possession. In love and sex, both have an element of possession in them. We're very uncomfortable with that in our culture, the idea that in love, that we want to possess the other, or in sex that we want to possess the other, but it's actually there and very important. What makes us uncomfortable with it is this idea that possession sounds like that it ought to be something that I'm controlling the other person, a master-slave thing. But what makes love and sex so remarkable is indeed the fact that what we want to possess in the other is something that can only be given freely by the other. When the man wants to possess the affection or the desire of the woman, his love or his sexual desire is entirely contingent upon that being freely given. And this is one of the problems for many men, is the disillusion, I think, of this idea of I want to hold you. I want you to be my baby. I want to possess you, and I want to be special to you, and you to be special to me. I want to possess that. But then there's this control that comes about it that gets confused. In possession, the male wants to possess more often the woman's sexual desire. I want you to desire me sexually, whereas the woman more often wants to possess the other person's love. This is going to be a very important point in a few minutes. Next, please. Jealousy. Men tend to be more sexually jealous, and women tend to be more relationally jealous. Again, I wish I had my gradient here. All of these things are gender related and not gender specific. Next, please. The relation between sex and love reported is weaker for men and stronger for women. Next slide. So I think what I want to argue can be illustrated in Beneke's book, Men on Rape. These are men who are talking about rape. These are rapists or people who are thinking about rape, or were asked who are not rapists, who are asked under what conditions would you rape. I think that the following discussion, the following snippet here is very, very illustrative of male sexuality and how it may be very, very different than female sexuality, and how it can help us to explain a lot of problem behavior. Next, please. Let's say I see a woman. This is Sam who's talking about under what conditions might he consider raping someone. This is not a rapist. Let's say I see a woman and she looks really pretty and really clean and sexy, and she's giving off very feminine, sexy vibes. I think, wow, I'd like to make love to her. Immediately, there's that immediacy of wanting to have the sex, not the relationship, but the sex. But I know she's not really interested. It's a tease. And a lot of times women knows that she's giving off these good, and she'll use that and flaunt it. And it makes me feel like she's laughing at me, and I feel degraded. This is the point that I want to make. Next slide. I also feel dehumanized because I'm being teased. Just when I turn off, I cease to be human. Because if I go through with my human emotions, I'm going to want to put my arms around her and kiss her, and do that would be unacceptable. I don't like the feeling that I'm supposed to just stand there and take it and not to be able to hug or kiss her, so I'm just going to turn off my emotions. It's a feeling of humiliation because the woman has forced me to turn off my feelings, and I don't want to react that way. Next slide, please. If I were desperate enough to rape someone, it would be from wanting the person. Note that he said wanting the person. Here's the more important thing. But it would be a very spiteful thing. Just being able to say, I have power over you and I can do anything I want with you, because really I feel that they have power over me just by their presence. Just the fact that they can come up to me and make me melt and make me feel like a dummy makes me want revenge. They have power over me, so I want power over them. Now, next slide, please. Let's see where we're going here. So what the argument that I want to make here is that what we typically think is a blanket idea of misogyny, that the man hates the woman or the man devalues the woman, does it exist? I think so. But I think it is much more complicated than that. If you look at the weakness of this person here, this person who has this deep sexual urge, who's feeling marginalized in the sexual marketplace, is feeling humiliated, the feelings that we call misogyny, at least in this person, are coming from feelings of humiliation because I'm not high on the sexual marketplace. This is a pathetic and sad thing and a dangerous thing. But I do think that it is quite common and quite ubiquitous that a lot of the relational problems that we have come from this sort of thinking. And my point is this, that unless we understand that and make contact with it, we cannot solve the problem. If we simply say, for example, that men are misogynistic or men are socialized to be misogynistic or the like, or that men are dominating or that men want power or that men are seeking to have power, I think that that diminishes the actual process that's going on. And the way to move forward in order to resolve the problems is not through shame, cancel culture, firing people, for example, for the like, even though the demands are legitimate and women and people of color are tired of being marginalized and living the way they live. The only way to get through to this, though, is mutual understanding. Deep, mutual, compassionate understanding, even for behavior of people whose behavior we hate. I'm going to pass right through this, please. Let's keep going. Give me a whole bunch of clicks. Just go right through it, please. Yes, keep going. So here in sexual direction, right here, the man, I'm going to suggest to you, many, has this identity that is a separate identity to the woman's more relational identity. Again, these are gender related, not gender specific. The man gets his worth from feelings of competence separate from you. More often, many women get their worth more through a relational, I am how I relate to you. And this is in sexual desire, this is played off, I believe, in I want status as a sexual being. When such a person is sexually rejected, immediately you get shame and humiliation, which leads to two problems. One is withdrawal. The guy either withdraws or, click, you get rage. And this is part of the problem that we get. We've got to deal with this by understanding it and helping men create representations of self to keep this type of thing under control and to understand the woman's experience. Next, please. Keep going, just keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And everyday harassment. Next one. Stop, please. So the person that I'm talking about, this everyday male on the street, what is this person's sexualized experience in my view? Well, I desire you. I desire your body, attractive person. And my desire to you is a compliment. And goodness, I would like you to desire me the same way I desire you. And God, who wouldn't want such a thing? So I advance towards you, not having any clue of the other experience. I want to be treated as a person and not simply as an object. Your desire is threatening to me. Your desire results in penetration, which you do not experience in the same way, except if you're raped by a male. And I fear rape constantly. I want to suggest that the view on the left side, the view of this typical man on the street, is that next, could you hit it? The man cannot learn the female's experience, click please, on his own. It must be socialized. It must be socialized through deep interpersonal relations and compassion between the two of the people. This is not to say that women should give in or be happy. They must not. They must be as militant as possible. But we need, in my opinion, to have both a militant, you cannot do this to me anymore, as well as a reaching out to understand the causes of it and to be taking a much more relational approach to building new masculinities and new femininities that acknowledge this rather than try to explain it away. Keep going. I'm going to finish up. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Here we are. Back, please. You're doing a great job, Cecilea. I appreciate it so very much. So my point 3, I don't think that men are inherently cretins nor culturally cretins. In my view, we must create novel conceptions of masculinity and femininity that allow us to move beyond moralized, ideological binaries. I think it is the moralization of this stuff that is increasing the sexual harassment, etc., through resentment. And as difficult as it might be, I think that we have to do something different. That's all. Thank you so much. Thank
you. Our next speaker is Sarah LaChance Adams. She is a distinguished professor of philosophy and director of the Florida Blue Center for Ethics at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. She is also the managing editor of Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy. She is the author of Mad Mothers, Bad Mothers, and What a Good Mother Would Do, The Ethics of Ambivalence, and the co-editor of New Philosophies of Sex and Love. Her current project is titled An Ethics of Erotic Experience.
My response is called In Defense of War Games. Tom Digby's Love and War is a persuasive analysis of gender dynamics and heterosexual romance in militaristic societies. He connects male dominance to the core values of militarism, faith in the use of masculine force to solve problems, and the presumption of adversariality. Militaristic societies require a steady supply of warriors, ready to sacrifice themselves and to do violence to others. The prerequisite for this is the ability to suppress compassion. And I quote from Tom, "For a man to be an effective warrior and for a man to be continually ready as a potential warrior, what is most critically required is this: he must be able to manage the capacity to care about suffering. That is, he must be able to manage the capacity to focus selectively and sometimes suspend altogether the capacity to care about the suffering of others, but also his own suffering. In short, he must be emotionally tough." This creates a culture of emotionally disabled men who paradoxically suffer from tremendous fear. quote, fear of being seen as weak, fear of being seen as compassionate, fear of being seen as sensitive, fear of being seen like a woman, and above all, fear of being seen as fearful. Clearly, systemic change is needed to address these destructive dynamics, and Tom does address the need to change how boys are programmed. In the meantime, I wonder, what avenues for resistance are there for individuals who find themselves already within this hegemonic culture? Particularly as the mother of a still sweet 5-year-old boy, I wonder if he's destined to succumb to the warrior mindset. Must he man up or suffer locker room humiliations? Will he face the choice of being beaten up by someone or having to beat them up? Will he live with the fear of being seen as fearful? Where is his opportunity to resist? Digby rightly argues that men are trained to play the role of warrior from the time they're boys, starting from their toys. Digby writes, whenever I ask an audience or a class what best signals the boys section of a toy store, the immediate response is the guns. This is part of a larger pattern all over the world. The greater the tendency of a society to fight with other societies, the more likely it is the boys are going to play with toy weapons. Toy guns, toy spears, toy knives, toy clubs, toy bows and arrows, and of course sticks that they use to hurt each other. Of course, today, toy weapons are far less likely than virtual weapons in video games like the Call of Duty series. End quote. And it is true that my own little boy turns sticks into guns. He makes slingshots, he creates sand forts for plastic toy soldiers, and makes bombs out of bark to shoot at them. These are games he plays with his gentle, sweet, loving, feminist father, the games that he also played as a boy. When my husband Rob was a child, he played a wide variety of war games with his cousins, Johnny and Eric, and his brother Bill. They built bamboo forts at the Chesapeake Bay. One day they destroyed the fort of another group of kids, who then challenged them to a fight on the beach. The fight was avoided, and a settlement was reached thanks to the diplomacy of Rob's grandmother. Rob and his brother and cousins also played a range of war-themed board games: Risk, Axis and Allies, Panzerleader, Battleship, Stratego, Tank Battle, Samurai Swords, Hitler's War, Domain, Attack, Panzer Blitz, Starship Troopers, and more. They kept playing until college when gaming seemed uncool. But Rob picked it up again when he read The Artist's Way at 30, and it recommended returning to childhood pleasures to enhance your creativity. Upon meeting my husband, I was mystified as to how this gentleman could be so enamored of military culture. By the time I met him, he was an artist expressing his love of war-related imagery in paintings and collages. His art continues to overlap in many respects with his childhood play. Both are at once cheerful and grim. For example, he created a series of brightly colored collage-like paintings representing each of the countries targeted by George W. Bush after 9/11. Some of their elements included a portrait of Saddam Hussein, an Iraqi Fedayeen, which is a youth soldier trainee, a Korean rocket, a South Korean junk food wrapper, and an oil refinery. Another series is a giant map of the Great Lakes made from battleship game boards. He used the pegs to represent the thousands of shipwrecks there, red for fuel-powered vessels and white for wind. In another, he created battle scenes using painted pistachio shells to represent helmets, while pieces of rusty metal and other found objects formed the barricades, bunkers, and rubble of a devastated landscape. At first glance, his works look like they could be jolly advertisements for candy and toys. Seen more closely, they can be grave and forbidding. Although Digby's analysis suggests the opposite, playing war games did not instill my husband and his male cohort with a militaristic mindset. They are, to varying degrees and in their own styles, artists, environmentalists, nurturers, musicians, socialists, and feminists. While I think that Digby's critique of the gendering of toys is correct, It can be an effective and pernicious way to perpetuate the status quo. It's important to remember that children are not passive recipients of playthings. Child's play has subversive potential. When children play, adult constructs are suspended. For this reason, I propose that children may repurpose war games for their own demilitarization. In Play and the Human Condition, Thomas Henricks describes play as a project of either descending or ascending meaning. Descending meaning emphasizes conformity and submission to otherness. It acknowledges, quote, the importance of external forms as guides for action and interpretation. Oriented in this way, people willfully cede control of the direction of action to patterns beyond themselves. Behavior develops as a strategy of self-adjustment, realignment, or what Piaget calls accommodation, end quote. When gender is strictly enforced, we are pushed to submit to pre-existent patterns of behavior, to cede control, to adjust, to accommodate. This is a clear example, oops, backing up here. So this is a clear example of descending meaning when we're forced to, when gender is enforced. It is as though a meaning comes down from above and it poses itself upon us. Descending meaning need not always be negative, however. It can be an important aspect of therapeutic play. For instance, when a child has experienced a great deal of trauma and has retreated into delusions, realignment to external forms is vital. For our purposes, however, thinking of how play might subvert gender norms, it is play as a project of ascending meaning that has the greatest potential. In this style of play, we impose our own action schemes on the environment. We try to find out what we can do in and to the world. Henricks thinks that this is the most genuine form of play, and he calls it, quote, a rebellion against the forms and forces of the world. In playing, children test their bodies, their minds, and their environments, as well as their social reality. Whatever toys they are given can become something completely different. I recall, for example, when my older sister was given a Cabbage Patch doll at the height of their popularity in the 1980s. This little cutesy dimpled baby, as I'm sure you remember, was transformed into a biker with a mohawk. In playing, children establish a reality that is experimentally tied to the real world. They use it to reinvent and challenge hierarchies and norms. In playing, they test ideas, behaviors, roles, and boundaries. As Henricks writes, play prizes a certain pattern of meaning creation, one that opens the possibilities and understandings of experience. Play centers on negotiations with the most particular aspects of the world, and then uses those little moments to instigate new patterns of relationships. When I asked my husband what connections he could draw between his childhood games, his adult board gaming, and the militaristic imagery in his art, they each sounded to me like strong examples of ascending meaning. This is quoting from him. For me, it's about connecting with my dad and the materials that he surrounded us with. It's about team colors, the connection to sports, loyalty and patriotism, flags and uniforms. When playing games with Keith and John, whether being Nazis or Americans or Japanese, we weren't connecting with a particular side. We're all pacifists, leftists, and skeptics. We weren't expressing nationalism. We were trying to understand the world and deconstruct the militarism and indoctrination. It's similar in my art, understanding what does it mean to be a man, to be an American. For example, I'm ridiculing Bush's use of the rhetoric of the axis of evil. He was trying to set it up like World War II. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys, and we're the good guys. He was using it like a political shorthand. I was playing off the blatant political rhetoric with the surface shallowness of the pop art aesthetic by using the easily acceptable propagandistic style. It seems to me that part of what has enabled my husband to resist warrior masculinity has been his playing war games and his creating war-themed art. Both art and play can make manifest the overlap between our shared empirical world and our first-person attempts to make sense of it. Descending meanings, such as the idea that violence demonstrates strength, can be taken into the small world of manageable toys, represented and transformed. Even quite abstract concerns like gender identity and nationalism can be made concrete and manipulated. For these reasons, the therapeutic benefits of both art and play are well recognized. My 5-year-old son is at what I think of as the age of anger. Anger is a new emotion to him, and at least once a day it overwhelms him. He wants to scream, to punch us, and to hit our little dog. But he knows that if he does that, he won't like the consequences. He does do it sometimes anyway, though. He's coming up against powerlessness, against the well of his own feelings, of those bigger than him, and of pre-existent morality, and he's also working it out through play. As he animates the material world, he overcomes his powerlessness. He fills his world with good guys and bad guys. He wields fantastical weapons. He rains down poisonous sand that only hurts those who deserve it. He has camouflage that makes him invisible. He can demolish and rebuild 1,000 tiny worlds of his own invention. He takes these forms that are given to him and finds new patterns of relationships, opening new possibilities of understanding. Through these fantasies, he's experimenting with weakness, power, anger, and destruction. But it doesn't result in any real humiliation, violence, pain, or consequences. He doesn't really have to go to war. He doesn't really have to be tough. He can also play with his baby doll and snuggle his giant plush shark. He can dissolve into a hug like a pat of butter on warm toast. He can still be the first person in the family to be willing to do someone a favor or to respond to someone's sadness. He can still wear his sister's pink bicycle helmet without concern. He can keep playing with his best friend who's a little girl. My hope is that by playing war games, my son can continue to toy with militarism rather than surrender to it. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Michael Deckard. So Michael is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Lenoir-Rhyne University. He has been co-teaching a course with John Floyd entitled Love and War, using Tom Digby's book, among others, and is working on a co-written book with John entitled Into the Light, The Promise and Peril of Teaching Gender-Based Violence and on College Campuses. He has published extensively on the history of emotion, as well as issues related to violence and war. He and John also have a forthcoming article this summer called Teaching Love and War in the book Collaborating for Change, Transforming Cultures to End Gender-Based Violence in Higher Education, which is edited by Susan Marine and Ruth Lewis and published by Oxford University Press. And if you go to the SPE website, you can find a link to that paper. Michael?
So one thing I was wanting to ask is a somewhat simple question, but I want to start, as Tom Digby does with his book, with a provocative and thought-provoking quote. Each of his chapters begins with such a thing, and I always enjoyed reading just those sometimes and wondering, are you going to take this up? Maybe, maybe not. So I'm going to take a quote from George Jackson. He wrote this in 1972 from prison. Nothing can bend consciousness more effectively than a false arrest, a no-knock invasion, careless, panic-stricken gunfire. These will frighten some, anger others. Common sense alone tells whom the people will turn their anger against. So the precise nature of emotion, whether the love in the title of his book or other emotions such as anger, are never explicitly discussed as emotions. They're discussed throughout, but never what is an emotion. Neither is war mentioned per se as, let's say, you define terrorism and you define even feminism, but the actual words love and war are not precisely defined. Defined. If one looks up the word love in the index, it says, see faith, fantasy, heterosexual love, masculine romanticism. That's on page 220. In order to make sense of Digby's book, one may ask the question, and this is my question. I'm trying not to get the 90s one-hit wonder in my head, because once you get it in there, you can't get it out. But what is love? Baby, don't hurt me no more. Where does it come from? Does love hurt another? Does it become angry and strike out? And if so, is it truly love? One fairly recent author on emotion, Daniel Gross, speaks to a secret history of emotion that runs like an undercurrent behind our societal actions. How we act and how we vote is determined in some sense by our emotions. It is helpful to stop and ask the question, where do emotions come from? Whether with regards to anger, fear, love, or apathy, Daniel Gross writes, only by treating emotions historically will we be able to figure out at what cost to our political sensibilities these terms of emotion and its absence were transformed from civic virtues into civic vices, end quote. Taking up Gross's suggestion about treating emotions historically and connecting these emotions to how we act and vote in the world, I wish to focus primarily on the use of love and a little bit on anger for the sake of these comments on Digby's thought-provoking and meaningful book that, as Dawn mentioned, we've been teaching in class for at least 4 or 5 years now, I think about since it came out. And I've been teaching a course with love and war, not always titled that, but since 2010, and in which I look at the history of love. So one thing I want to do in these comments is just give you a very short history. Oxford has very short introductions, and this is a very short history of love going back to the ancients that I think is not always highlighted when we teach philosophy or when we teach history. It gives some, I think, undercurrents that Tom talks about in the present, but that go back a long way. So the first section of this is called Greek love, and I put Greek in quotes. There are 2 kinds of Greek love that I will refer to here. The first kind is that expressed by fraternities and sororities, particularly on college campuses, in which the highest numbers of incidences of sexual violence occur. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but one book that we use in our class, Love and War, is by Kelly Oliver, and it's called Hunting Girls. And she goes into she teaches at Vanderbilt, and she talks a lot about how fraternities and sororities, even at places like Yale, who came up with the chant, yes means no, no means anal, came up by Greek life. The second kind of Greek life is that expressed in ancient Greece by what would be considered the founders of philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. They both define love in meaningful but different ways. One way of making sense of love or defining it is by means of eros, which has a sexual component, but is fundamentally, for Plato at least, a striving or yearning for the good. As Simon May describes it, quote, as love matures, it progresses from loving one beautiful body to loving beautiful bodies in general. For the lover, focused as he is on beauty, quickly realizes that physical beauty in any person is closely akin to physical beauty in any other. There is one excellent example that I wish to use from Plato's text regarding the ancient origin of love, and I would say war at the same time, in the sense that Tom means by it. And it is the beginning of the dialogue Phaedrus. The tall plane tree marks the site. On such a hot day, a cool resting place with shade and a moderate breeze makes for the perfect spot. Socrates is letting Phaedrus lead, and it is he that first asks, and I quote from the very first couple of pages of Phaedrus, "Tell me, Socrates, is it not from some place along here by the Ilissus that Boreas is said to have carried off Oreithyia?" "Yes, that is the story," Socrates responds. End quote. The locale has a prehistory, a mythical setting, and this setting begins a story about love and rhetoric. In other words, the entire text is about seduction. The truth is that this is on the level of hearsay or doxa, opinion, since the abduction may have occurred several miles downstream. But when one is speaking of Boreas, the god of wind, and Oreithyia, a young human girl, then the facts are difficult to pin down. As Daniel Werner describes it, quote, according to one version of the myth, the version that Phaedrus reports, the young girl Oreithyia was playing by the banks of the Ilissus when Boreas, god of the north wind, swept down and abducted her. Boreas then carried her off to a rock and had intercourse with her, end quote. Not only does this story point to an ancient origin of love and war, but it also points to the beginning of the problem Digby is talking about, a problem that continues in Greek life today. Second section is medieval love. Like I said, it's a very short history. As in Greek love, much of our modern society is structured in terms of power and control. The law is structured in such a way that property rights are the basis in which marriage and other relationships are built. Take one story of sex, power, and control, Helwaz and Abelard. While Socrates seduced his students, philosophy professor Peter Abelard did something similar to his student who was somewhere between 15 and 30 years younger than him, Helwaz. Their exchange of letters speaks to another element of romantic love and its ability to become both physical and spiritual. Whereas Plato and Aristotle separated these, the issue of a power dynamic became crucial, such that teacher and student blended the physical, intellectual, and spiritual. While the medieval tradition does not fundamentally challenge the Greek one or change the definition of love in a significant way, the role of power and property, or politics, becomes more salient with respect to emotions. By reading the letters of Abelard and Helwaz, or the troubadour songs from the courtly love tradition, one can see that we are closer to a romantic conception of love recognizable to us today. In several places in Digby's book, he refers to Nietzsche's slave metaphor. I think it's mentioned in at least 5 or 6 of the chapters, and thinks that according to Nietzsche, women ought to be the slave of men, quote, telling us how we ought to behave, from page 79 of Tom's book. The woman, by means of love, total devotion with soul and body, her love is a faith. While Digby doesn't mention the medieval story of Helwaz and Abelard, this sounds precisely like a letter of Helwaz from 1133, some 15 years after her being seduced by him and his being castrated shortly thereafter, as some of you may know the story. And I quote from this letter of Helwaz, and I think it's nice to hear voices of sexual violence from even almost 1,000 years ago. Quote, you must know that you are bound to me by an obligation which is all the greater for the further close tie of the marriage sacrament uniting us, and are the deeper in my debt because of the love I have always borne you, as everyone knows, a love which is beyond all bounds, end quote. And you could take hundreds of passages, and I took kind of one random one. Her words in letters to Abelard absolutely speak to what Digby quotes with the song, I Surrender All. There is really no better example than the 12th century abbess, and the courtly love tradition that defined emotional devotion to a lover that becomes resonant with a kind of slavery of which Nietzsche speaks. This form of medieval love, almost unheard of in the ancient world, becomes a problem, if not the problem of love, undergirding what Digby speaks of as, quote, the view of women as property owned by men reflected in laws which traditionally have deemed a woman, just like a slave, to be some man's property, whether it be her father, husband, or brother. And I am not going to go into any more detail, but in the psychoanalytic tradition, many of them point to, including in Simon May's book, Love, a History, to the courtly love tradition as being the origin of what we would call today romantic love. One can argue about that, but I think that is a very interesting 12th century phenomenon that happened at the same time as Abelard and Eloise's letters. The third section I want to look at is called modern love. And actually, when I mean modern, I'm really talking here about 1600 to 1800. In philosophy, that's usually the modern period, like Descartes to Kant. The view that emotions are somehow connected to physiological movements in the body, and I'm not going to go into much detail because my alarm is going off to keep track of time, like the boiling of the blood, is a rather recent phenomenon. And I'm just going to take one quote here and then conclude, because I do not want to go over time. Like I looked at Abelard and Eloise, I also want to look at Descartes and Elizabeth. Descartes and Elizabeth have a correspondence, and some have argued whether this is the origin of the mind-body problem, and also Descartes' writings on passions, and perhaps all of modern philosophy's view of passions as a psychophysiological experience.
I'm just listening. Do you want to listen, or no? I'll get my earphones.
A quote from one letter of Descartes says to Elizabeth, "The remedies she has chosen, that is, those of diet and exercise, in my opinion, are the best of all. After, however, those of the soul, which has without a doubt a great power over the body, as is shown by the great changes that anger, fear, and the other passions excite in it. But it is not by its will directly that the soul conducts the animal spirits to the places where they can be useful or harmful. It is only in willing or thinking of some other thing." End quote. Whereas what Digby calls the beauty industrial complex tells us what will make us happy or well, keeping alive by cultural inertia the romantic fantasies, Descartes provides a different remedy to Elizabeth. In my words, but summarizing him, think positively and your body will be fine. Don't be sad. Well, not word for word what Descartes says, it is the gist. And if what Digby says about what happens in war-reliant cultures, that, quote, an emotional disability is socialized into boys that results in men being more challenged than women at offering cultural comfort, one can find this precise problem in Descartes' letters to Elizabeth. Even at the very modern, different definition of an emotion like anger, say the boiling of the blood, for instance, or in George Jackson that I quoted at the beginning, blood in my eye, Digby's claim that the only emotion deemed manly is anger, that's from page 102 of his book, it seems to me that a new understanding of and definition for emotions is needed. Is love the emotion that Digby is going for in his book? In nearly all of the cases that he speaks of, it does not appear like love is really there. Some of the marriage cases, for example, the one that Don spoke of earlier with the military couple. Having seen some history of love in this talk, we are able to make the story a little more complex in the sense that Greek love still rears its ugly head when, and I quote Digby, the most treacherous time for a college woman is when she is at a party drinking with people she thinks she knows. So my concluding question, in light of protests and activism like Women's March and Black Lives Matter, and anger that is being felt right now that I don't have to exactly point to is that, is it love that you want? It could be in the name of love, but rather, and perhaps, or in addition to love, a kind of anger that places the dominant, submissive, or the providers, procreators, warriors paradigm that he speaks of, with in touch with the Me Too movement, and to place and to rethink what is this love, what is the emotions in general, and to very much conclude, I point to Judith Butler's book that just came out a month or two ago called The Force of Nonviolence. It's from her Gifford lectures. And I think Judith Butler's Force of Nonviolence says that this is a stronger power, more forceful than violence. And so I think Tom Digby is really pointing at something like a force of nonviolence, or a peaceful force like Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King. And that this challenged the status quo of the beauty industrial complex and to modern love, based as it is in medieval law and Hobbesian power, takes up what Don Floyd and I argue, quoting Plato's Symposium, and I quote Plato himself, "For violence never touches love, and when he is active, he never employs it."
Well, all great contributions. So I'm not going to take them in any particular order necessarily, but I do hope in the process of the discussion to interweave my responses in ways that will ultimately respond to all the criticisms and comments. Not that they're all criticisms, but let me just set this up by starting with Dawn's comment. Things are getting worse, and retaliation is getting worse in particular. And I certainly, first of all, you're the expert on that, but it's something I've noticed as well. And I do think that's important to keep in mind that as a philosopher, I'm concerned about the cultural factor here, how culture works. Mike pointed out there are these epigenetic relationships between biology and culture and so on, and all that is of course correct. But as a philosopher, I can't do anything about biology. I'm neither a pharmacologist nor a surgeon or whatever. I can't do anything about biology. But I can address culture, and that's what I try to do. And one of the factors, I would assume that this would not be a controversial thing to say, one of the factors that has made things worse in the last 3.5 years is that we have a raving misogynist as president, and someone who is continually displays insecurity about his masculinity. In the book, I think I referred to, I know I referred to a masculinity quotient, and I think I even describe a gauge that every man is walking around with a sort of gauge, like a masculinity gauge, that's constantly fluctuating throughout the day. I mean, literally throughout the day, and with his masculinity constantly going up and down. Well, you imagine that when you're watching Trump. I mean, it's really extraordinary. His masculinity fluctuating continually. He's the most unstable, with respect to masculinity specifically, the most unstable person imaginable. But at the same time, he's president of the United States. He's arguably the most powerful person in the world. So he has huge influence on the culture. So I think that's one factor in things getting worse. Also, but about things that perhaps may be changing. And oddly enough, let's talk about the police. Actually, that's I'm sure very much on all of our minds, and I really appreciate Shira bringing up that factor. And it almost seems like a blatant omission in the book. I did do a quick search through the book, and other than policing gender and policing masculinity and things like that, or which doesn't count, of course, there was one reference to military and police heroes and their role in the culture and so on. But so that's a pretty weak contribution to the role of police and this whole problem. So, and the question that has arisen, of course, is do we need cops? And if we need cops, how can we make them different? And I think, for example, of the London machete guy, some of you, this is on YouTube if you haven't seen it. I'm not sure what to Google, but probably the London machete guy. But he's this guy he's raving with a machete, and the London cops, so far as I know, none of the ones who responded to him were armed, right? But they have batons and they have shields, and they pull the shields out of a van or something, a truck or something, and they surround him, and they gradually come closer and closer to him with the shields and the batons, so that eventually he is confined and he can't attack anybody because he's basically wrapped in a cocoon of shields. So, I mean, that just is an example of that there are all sorts of creative ways that cops can respond to violence in ways that are not themselves violent, right? So obviously there's a lot of discussion right now about abolishing police, defunding police, and so on, and that gets into policy factors that are beyond my competence. But certainly there are things that we can do to train police differently, and different techniques that we can teach them, and also we can provide. When you look at the things that cops are called for, probably a significant majority of the 9/11 calls to which police respond are not things that police should be responding to. Homelessness, I mean, really. So the problem with cops is the same as the problem with is very much related to the book and the way that we bring up little boys, because the problem with cops is that they tend to be excessively concerned about their masculinity. Their masculinity is more fragile and unstable than the masculinity of other men. Men who become cops, like men who become who go into the military frequently, especially the Marines. That's the branch that my best friend and I tried to join when we were 17, signed the enlistment documents and everything, took the test, and so on. I've noticed that over the years, when I see interviews with young men about why they join the military, it's almost always something about proving their masculinity or finding out if they're real men, etc. And with cops, men who become cops, again, it's not that they're all the recruits in either case are the same, but there is a tendency to think that being a cop or being in the military is a way to prove or assert your masculinity. So, but the thing is, the contingency here, I mentioned earlier about that looking at other cultures helped me get a sense of the contingency of how gender and militarism work in our society. Police in the U.S. kill by shooting, and they kill in other ways, obviously, but they kill by shooting 1,000 people every year. If you compare, in England and Wales, 3 people were shot and killed by police last year. Roughly as many, 22, were killed over the past decade as they're killed by the US in an average week. Police in Australia shot and killed between 1 and 11 people each year from 1991 to 2017, according to a government report. Killings by police in Japan are extremely rare. So this has nothing to do with urban, factors and so on. But one thing to keep in mind is that, and this gets to to Mike's point about Mike seemed to understand misogyny as a way of blaming men and that sort of thing, and I don't view it that way at all. Actually, I'm very much not into blaming. I actually have a paper. It's one of my favorite papers that gets almost no attention, but published in, I don't know, 1902 or something. But it was on the criminal guilt. It was called "No One is Guilty," and the one is italicized to emphasize the individuality part of this, right? No one is guilty. Crime, patriarchy, and individualism. But my point is just that I don't think blame and guilt tripping are ever, they very rarely are valuable or effective. So I think that's a bad idea. And blaming police, I don't think is very effective. Doing something about police is effective, can be effective, and certainly things can be done. And like Derek Chauvin should go to prison, given that that's how we treat murderers and so on. But the problem is that if we blame police exclusively, that can effectively deflect from our understanding that one important factor in our police problem is our own pervasive cultural militarism, including our faith in masculine force. That's the reason we have cops who kill so many people is because of our culture, right? And in particular, there are the kind of masculinity that we inculcate in boys growing up. Furthermore, it's not just our faith in masculine force, it's also our sweeping presumption of adversariality. That's part of cultural militarism. You don't find that in all cultures. And my favorite group are the Semay people of Malaysia, who live in the mountains of Malaysia. They have no gender and they have no militarism. They have no war. They have no violence. They have no rape, no theft. They have no problems like that at all. And the reason is because there are always material conditions that lead to societies being militaristic or not being militaristic. In the case of the Semay people, they live at the tops of mountains, and they are on average less than 5 feet tall. They're surrounded in the lower parts of the mountain by people who are of average or greater height. And so the way they've survived as a society is by not fighting, right? Now, there are other groups of people who are relatively small who develop weapons that can be used against larger people, as in some tribes of Africa. But the Semay people simply run, and they raise their children accordingly. The children are not gendered in any way. And the one emotion, and in fact, the children really don't get much childcare at all. They pretty much just do their own thing. The one thing that's discouraged in children is anger, because that's the militaristic emotion. That's the emotion of violence, right? But other than that, the children are pretty much free to be children. So, so the problem is that we tend to we need to look at our own culture and understand that this is that police malfeasance is a manifestation of our culture. And it's a manifestation of our culture in two ways. First of all, our cultural militarism is faith in masculine force and presumption of adversariality, like I said. But the second is that we bring up boys, all boys, virtually all boys, to manifest those values and to experience anxiety to the extent that they don't embody those values. And we fuel that pressure with and anxiety with misogyny. So it's no wonder that cops are substantially more likely than other men to engage not only in the violence that we associate with cops, shooting people, chokeholds, and so on, but they're also more likely to engage in domestic violence. They're also more likely, well, I won't go on, but so there seems to be, as a general pattern, this doesn't apply to all cops, obviously, but as a general pattern, there's more misogyny among cops, just as there's more domestic violence among male members of the military. So that's part of the problem. The other problem, of course, the associated problem is that because we bring boys up like that generally to have these anxieties about masculinity, many of them turn to guns as a way, not just toy guns, but actual guns, including AR-15s and so on, as ways of expressing their masculinity. In lectures, I sometimes use a slide of the Remington Arms ad for the AR-15. It advertises AR-15, and it says your man card reissued, right, by owning an AR-15. So we have more gun ownership than any other country in the world. I'm pretty sure that's right, isn't it? I think that's correct. And so the role of being a cop is more dangerous because there are more guns in society. So we're really kind of in a double bind in some respects. It seems, when I think about abolishing the police, defunding the police is one thing, because that means generally, I think, turning some of the money away in other directions. But in terms of, I'm going to try to weave in a little optimism here. The Connecticut Police Chiefs Association today announced that they are no longer going to accept arms from the federal government under the, is it 1033 program, Shira? All right, under the 1033 program. So, and of course, there are lots of other cases of cops who are beginning to respond to what's been going on in the last few weeks, police chiefs, mayors, and so on, who are responding in important ways. We'll see how this works out. But if we elect a president other than Donald Trump in November, that I think will make a huge difference, and especially having a woman vice president, which is guaranteed if Biden is elected, then that will make a big difference too. So, so the problem again is that the role of misogyny, to me, it's not about Mike, so much blaming men, blaming boys, and that sort of thing, guilt tripping them, and so on, individual boys and men. I don't think that's particularly helpful, but it is important to help individual boys and men understand the role of misogyny in society and how misogyny impacts their own lives. I gave a lecture at the college, my alma mater, a couple of years ago, and it's William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri. I'm from Arkansas originally, very conservative, racist, fundamentalist background. But they invited me, and my book had been published, and they invited me to come give a lecture. And I had been in a fraternity when I was there, and all the members of my fraternity were required to come to my lecture, and they were all sitting together in the back quadrant of the audience. I knew which ones were what they were. And at one point, one of them got up and said, because I always talk feminism in my lecture, I usually wait until the last fourth or third or something like that. You know, I want to get them hooked and excited about what I'm talking about first before I ever drop the F-bomb. But eventually I did. And one of them said, well, but why should a man be feminist? Why should a man act against his own interests? And I practically, I had to wire my jaw on, but I say, look, if you think that you can, and here's where we get to a point raised by Michael. If you think that if you want, look, if you want to be heterosexual in your life, and I'm assuming most of these fraternity brothers of mine, whatever, want to be heterosexual, right? Want to be straight, plan on being straight, so on. If you want to be heterosexual and have flourishing relationships with women, right? You damn well better become an ardent feminist. I mean, a really passionate, committed, militant feminist, because that's your only hope. Otherwise, you're screwed, and not in the way that you're hoping, right? So, and the way this relates to Michael's point is, I as he was talking and as I was reading his notes before, I'm reminded of Pausanias in the Symposium. Pausanias talks about Plato's Symposium. Pausanias talks about a vulgar love and heavenly love. And he says the vulgar love is the love of someone who just wants to have sex with anybody that they can, just all the time, constant sex with as many people as possible, and that sort of thing, because it's all about completing the sex act. That's what it's all about, right? That's vulgar love. And he's kind of disdainful of that. Now, I should point out that he was in a relationship with Agathon for about 30 years. So he's, I don't know how, I don't know the details of their relationship, but they were in a solid relationship for 30 years. And so Pausanias says there's common love and heavenly love. That's common love, or vulgar love is this kind of, that's oriented around physical sex. And then there's heavenly love. And heavenly love is the love that men have for each other. He says about vulgar love, that men who pursue vulgar love will have sex with anybody, man, woman, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? And in Arkansas, where I'm from, watermelons, whatever, right? That always gets my students wondering what the hell I'm talking about. But so, but heavenly love is a different kind of love, and it's a love that's only between a man and another male, a boy, young man, whatever, but only between two men, two males. And the reason, as he says, is because men are by nature stronger and more intelligent. Men are by nature stronger and more intelligent. So the idea being that men are attracted to people who are, and these were the two qualities that the Greeks especially valued in men, of course, both intelligence, at least among the Athenians, and Spartans, more just the strength, but among the Athenians, strength, and I'm assuming he means physical strength, but it could be a broader kind of strength, but probably physical strength and intelligence. And but the idea is that the reason that men are only attracted to other men, there's the men who want heavenly love, the really good, the noble kind of love, something like that, which does include sex. It's just that it's not driven primarily by sex. The men who pursue that don't want to have sex with women because they are less strong, less intelligent. Well, the broader picture here is that men, the Greek men, the Athenian Greek men, simply didn't respect women the way they respect men. And you want to have love, you want to have a relationship with someone, mutual respect is crucial to a loving relationship. So it would not be something like, let me see if I can scroll down and find Michael's. Michael says, what is love? Where does it come from? Does love hurt another? Does it become angry and strike out? If so, is it truly love? And he had some other comments about that too. And toward the end said, what is love? If it is not love that the person wants, perhaps it is peace or nonviolence, something like that. And well, it is those things, I think, right? I mean, I think when people pursue love, well, all right, but love that works, right? I'm very, very much a pragmatist as well as a phenomenologist, but love that works is love that involves mutual respect. If you don't have mutual respect, you're out of luck. And that's why it's absolutely essential for any heterosexual man to be, I mean, a committed, militant feminist, right? And in order to have happy, fulfilling relationships with women, and not just happy, fulfilling relationships, heterosexual relationships, romantic relationships, but also to be able to work well with women at work and that sort of thing, right? Because it's the same way at work, right? When you find in the Me Too movement, these men who are abusing women, and when you find throughout academia and its Me Too cases and so on, you find men who are exploiting women, abusing women, discriminating against women, harassing women, and so on. It's not based on respect. I mean, the one thing that's really clear about all these cases is that they do not respect women. If they did, they wouldn't be doing these things. So, and that's part of what is involved with cops too. cops, and that relates, I think, to the racist element of police brutality, is that these cops who and it's not always white, it's not always just white cops, I should point out, right? But it's usually white cops, but sometimes it's black cops, and that gets really complicated when you have a black cop being brutal towards a black person, victim actually of police violence. That gets really complicated, and I don't think I want to get into that right now. But with white men and more than just white men, with cops generally, but especially white cops, that disrespect for a group of people, in this case, not women, but rather a racial minority, that is a crucial part of the picture. So, and I just, let's see. One thing I wanted to say actually about the gender binary factor, there's a great article. Let me just recommend this to everybody, actually. There's a great article. Let me get the exact title. It's in the Scientific American blog, and it's called "Stop Using Phony Science to Justify Transphobia." It's a great short summary critiquing the sex/gender binary, and it shows that it's just not what we mostly learned about when we were growing up in junior high or high school science classes and that sort of thing. It's really complicated. You can have XX chromosomes and have testicles. You can have XY chromosomes. And I'm sorry, XY chromosomes and have ovaries and so on. And you can have XXY chromosomes. I mean, there's so many possibilities. And this article goes in and explains all the physiological factors that are involved in this, including the testosterone and estrogen, progesterone factors and so on. But there's really no biological binary there. The binary that we all see that seems so obvious to us is superimposed by culture. It's not something we get from biology itself. We get it from biologists sometimes. I certainly haven't heard biologists insist that there's a gender binary, but those biologists are clearly victims of the cultural programming that they've received. Well, I should probably I guess I should probably stop. But I think that everybody made some really important points, really great points, and I don't want, Dawn, your paper was definitely the most depressing. Your contribution was the most depressing contribution to the panel, which is a great compliment. Okay, but nonetheless, and in part, to be true confession, I mean, I am an inveterate optimist, and when I wrote the book, but I to me, and I view history dialectically. I think when Trump is gone, and you've got Biden, who, I mean, there are all sorts of, I mean, I've been extraordinarily critical of Biden on Facebook and Twitter and so on, right, at times in the past. But the fact is, he really is a strong feminist. He's a flawed feminist, but he's a really strong, committed feminist. He really believes in it. And this idea of committing to name a woman vice president and so on, I think we're going to see a whole new shift in the culture. These things just like after the Vietnam War, we saw a trend away from militarism, and all simultaneously a trend away from sexism and gender, excessive genderization and so on. And then of course Ronald Reagan came along, et cetera. But so I think there's hope. The retaliation thing is, if you look at retaliation as a sign of that people are excessively seeing themselves as victims, again, the parallels of Trump. I mean, Trump's whole life is an allegory about masculinity, or his life and his performance in the last 3.5 years are like, it's like an allegory about masculinity in our society generally. But to the extent that men view themselves as victims, to the extent that cops view themselves as victims, right, they will lash out and so on. But if it's in the bigger picture, and that's the luxury of being a philosopher, I look at the bigger picture. I think there's hope.
Great. Thank you, Tom. So before we go on to questions, I actually just want to ask you to speak a little bit about something that I don't think was emphasized enough, which I thought was one of the most poignant points of your book. And that is the effects of gender policing on men and boys, and how that actually causes them to hate women, which then interferes with heterosexual relationships.
It interferes with what?
Heterosexual, like having a healthy heterosexual relationship.
Right.
And I think this can also speak towards Sarah's point about play and how we can imagine play.
That's the other thing that I meant to emphasize. Actually, I have this sort of chaotic list of notes that I took as you were speaking. But about Sarah's point, that seemed that I had not thought about that before until I read her draft. But I think that's really extraordinarily important. I mean, having some ironic play can be incredibly powerful, politically powerful. Think of Sarah Cooper. You've all seen Sarah Cooper, right? When she, if you don't know who Sarah Cooper is, immediately after you leave, Google Sarah Cooper. She does these not impressions of Trump. She actually uses audio of Trump's voice, but she performs his voice, and it's just incredible, actually. And it's among the most powerful ways of exposing Trump that you can imagine. It's really great. But that and it involves, an ironic, I guess, ironic distance. I don't know. But in any case, her sense of irony with this is incredible. And you laugh, and you're hearing Trump's voice saying things, and you laugh. You may have laughed when you first heard him say these things, right, about injecting Lysol and so on. But nonetheless, it's even funnier when you see her perform these things. But I see what your point, Sarah. Totally. When I read it, I thought, oh yes, I totally see your point. But it depends on the parenting, obviously, right? And your son's lucky to have the father that he has, I gather. But when I was growing up, I didn't have that, right? When we played with guns, and it was a rite of passage. I think I was 11 years old. My father gave me my first gun. My actual gun, that shot actual bullets and so on. So when I was growing up, it was a serious thing, and that's why at the age of 17, my best friend and I tried to join the Marines because we were seriously. And my best friend actually wound up going to Vietnam and came back with his brain turned to mush, but which is another factor that led to this book. But I think what you're talking about, having play as a factor here. And it reminded me of I gave a talk at I was the keynote speaker at a Gaming for Peace conference at Trinity College Dublin about a year and a half ago. And one of the things I learned there in one of the sessions was that some gamers play these first-person shooter games. I think that's what they're called, right? But they do it to avoid killing. Their goal is to get through the game without killing anyone, and if they do that, they win from their point of view, right? And these are incredibly violent video games, obviously, but if they can get through the game without killing anyone, the last thing I'd want to do is say that that all toy guns and all violent video games and so on are, have this sort of negative role. It kind of relates to what I said before about not blaming and guilt tripping and that sort of thing. I mean, whatever works, as far as, there's the pragmatist, right? Whatever works. And I can see how that, that might be the case. Yeah, your son's lucky. Yeah, your son's incredibly lucky to have that kind of an upbringing. And thanks for bringing up that point too, because I honestly had not thought about it before. So thanks. And that's another basis for optimism in response to Don's. I'm looking at you on the screen, and you probably can't tell that I'm looking at you, but in any case, but that's another. It relates to Don's concerns as well, I think. And maybe there can be video games. I wanted to become a video game designer after that conference. It was really an amazing conference. And I can imagine designing video games in which involve weaponry and war and that sort of thing, but yet where there is this sort of ironic distance, or this ironic play that you described. It's built into the video game, perhaps in some way. Sorry.
Thank you. Oh, no problem. I think Mason, do you want to start with a question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I was just trying to figure out how to fix my video, but apparently I have to go over to settings and change some things in order to do that, so I'll just do it verbally. It was just a question about the analogies many of us have been making here about mischaracterizations of the issues that often come up. The analogy with police action, for instance. I mean, we talk about structural racism and implicit bias, and objectors say, hang on, police officers are not racists. When we talk about masculinity as a problem, particularly toxic, fragile forms of masculinity, everybody comes back with, hang on, it's not a problem being a man. There's good things about being a man. No matter how much I point to Mr. Rogers as a perfect example of good masculinity, the objection is often characterized as masculinity as a whole in all its forms is of course problematic, as opposed to there are particular forms of masculinity that are deeply problematic. But it's very difficult to figure out how to make those arguments clearly when we're talking about the general background cultural phenomena of masculinity, which is deeply implicit and deeply ingrained in all of us, even those who are trying to resist the more toxic, fragile forms. So I'm really interested in these sort of cultural aspects and how we can address those without alienating the people we most want to talk to. The point earlier on about gaming, I play Dungeons and Dragons with a bunch of friends, all of whom are deep Republicans. More than half of them are Trump supporters. This is my insight into their world. We can be respectful and play games together. We try not to talk about politics too much because it distracts from the games. But these guys are deeply concerned about sort of being accused of toxic forms of masculinity and saying, hang on, I'm teaching my son to be a real man, and that's how a real man should parent. So try to address that culture without offending and alienating the people we most want to speak to has always been a difficult balancing act. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, please.
So should we have our whole panel kind of give their take on that question? So we'll start with you, Tom. And
whoever
then
feels like it would be welcome, please.
Shira. I think it's kind of nice to have a diversity, I think, of people.
Yeah, well, I've been talking a lot, so perhaps, somebody else would like to.
How about you call on someone, Tom?
I mean, let me say something really quick while other people are feeling the pressure and getting ready to getting primed to address it. Over the years, when I've been lecturing on this subject, I've frequently encountered people who who like this idea of novel forms of masculinity, changing masculinity, having alternative forms of masculinity, and so on. And they're having a kinder masculinity and so on. But every time I encounter an example like this, a case of this, the qualities that are designated as being part of this new kind of masculinity, alternative masculinity, turn out to be qualities that would be good qualities of all human beings generally, not specifically of men. So I get over the years, I've tried to challenge people to give me some idea of an alternative masculinity that does not consist of qualities that would be desirable among all human beings. So they're not really, so it's, if these are qualities that are desirable among all human beings, then what's masculine about it? You know, why is it? Because masculine seems to be specific to men. And of course, this gets back to the whole concept of men and even male being culturally constructed anyway. So, but, so I've not been able to come up with any example of an alternative masculinity. The closest I've heard would be like a feminist masculinity that I reviewed an article for a journal a few years ago, and the author, who was a man, as I recall, it was something like a feminist masculinity involves sort of being really assertive as a feminist or something. I don't know. I can't remember now what it was, but it seemed like a curious and interesting idea, but ultimately I don't really see. I mean, what's the value? The only value I would think would be in terms of leveraging it into getting men to change. I don't see ultimately there's any cultural value of the notion of masculinity at all, unless it's just sort of temporary, some sort of transitional masculinity or something like that, you know, to get men to take on, or to change away from traditional masculinity and do something, you know, different. And so maybe it's of sort of political utility or something like that, transitional utility. I don't know. Shira, your microphone. There we go.
Okay. I want to take a stab at this because I think this is one of those $1 million questions, and it's something that I talk about with my students as well. Like, if we know that these are all the problems, then how do we rebuild? And so what I want to put on the table are two frameworks that aren't about naming masculinity types per se, but how point more towards like sort of how we engage with each other as sort of new paradigms is what I'm suggesting. So the first is, and I think that Michael mentioned call out culture or cancel culture, and we're very much impacted by that. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is how we can shift that to a calling in culture as opposed to cancel culture, because that impacts not just Twitter or Facebook, or I don't know about TikTok, but it impacts conversations and free speech in classrooms, at universities, where presumably we're sharing and engaging in a variety of ideas. So calling in rather than canceling or calling out would be the paradigm shift that I would want to see sort of infusing our conversations. And that along with, and this is something I've written about, this question, and it comes up specifically in relation to men and masculinity and feminism, but I think it applies more broadly. How can we think about ourselves and our engagements in ways where we hold people accountable for bad behavior? I don't like using that word bad, but you know, bad behavior, while also accepting the fact that as human beings, we are flawed and therefore imperfect. And how do we do both of those things at the same time? And one of the things that I notice is that in conversations, and especially with students who are very, very at the ready to break down the binary when it comes to gender, maintain a very binary epistemology when it comes to you're either right or you're wrong, you're either in the group or you're not. And so moving beyond that binary in an epistemological sense, in a social media sense, in a conversational sense, is something I want to put out there. It's a big ask, I recognize.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm blown away by what you just said. I'm going to take it and run with it and talk about call in. Did you say call in? Did you say?
Yeah, call in. Yeah.
Call in culture. I love that. I think that's wonderful. The question the gentleman asked was about how do we, talk to the person on the other side about these issues. And I actually think that you just answered the question. And I think that that it has to do with moral humility. Moral humility. We call in, that would be one way. But there's also another way as well, and that is to believe, to try to look past the position that is being expressed by the person on the other side, and try to look at the, if you will, underneath it, to what's driving it. What are the pleas? What are the fears? What are the feelings? What are the needs that drive that position? And that requires a bit of moral humility. I may be able actually to learn something. If I don't believe that I'm necessarily always right, I might be able to learn something from the Trump supporter, from the sexist, from the racist, that sort of thing. If we could be open enough to them to see that there may be that there may be something in there that I can touch and understand, well, then maybe we can have better dialogues. That's moral humility. I want to say one other thing too, if I can, about masculinity, because Tom, it sounds like you're saying that there's no such thing as valuable masculinity.
I didn't mean to say that, but go ahead.
All right, and I think that that's precisely the type of feeling that people get when they recoil to these types of things. Let me just give you one example of what might be masculine. Okay, imagine two people making love. Imagine a man and a woman. Imagine the woman saying to the man, "Oh, I love your big, strong arms. Put them around me and hug me tight, okay? All right? Protect me," or whatever it is. All right, now this is primordial. It's basic. It's basic to this interaction, okay? So do we really want to say that in this lovely sexual encounter that the woman is kind of wrong, or that she's clearly appreciating the masculinity of this person?
I'm going to jump in with two really quick things. One is that I don't want to overlook the part of my equation where I'm totally on board with epistemological humility, with moral humility, and I'm also asking, how do we simultaneously hold people accountable? I'm not interested in understanding what your feelings are about race, why you're a racist. I'm interested in holding you accountable for that, and also understanding that we're flawed as human beings. So how do we do that without canceling, right? So
May
I'm
I?
asking something. Well, I want to add more.
Just one other thing. So Sarah wanted to respond as well. So if we could also give Sarah a chance.
Can I finish the second point? Or
yeah.
Okay. The second point is, and obviously longer conversation for another day, but Michael, when you're describing this heterosexual scenario and why shouldn't this woman be able to say, "Wrap your big strong arms around me," that conversation is not the problem. It's the penalty of gender that is the problem. It's all the things that come with it. It's not that itself. So I'll step back and interested in Sarah's comments.
I think, Sarah, you have to, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I was just rendered speechless for a minute there. Trying to go back to the previous thought. So to me, it's about, I'm going back to what Mason Cash brought up. So to me, it's about finding common values and speaking from the I place, you know, so it's like, well, this person has a child that they want to have a good life and they value that child and they want the best for them, and I can relate to that. And for me, it's about saying, so if I'm with somebody and they're talking about their son and they're saying, you know, I want my son to be strong and not have to be afraid, and so I give him a gun when he's 11 years old because that's the kind of world we live in, I can kind of relate to that, even though I'm like, I don't give my son a gun because that makes me afraid. But the kind of thing I would say would be, yeah, I can get that, but I also hate that sometimes boys are put into this position where they're only allowed to be tough. And my own experience indicates, and this is anecdotal, that most people are not that one-dimensional. And I usually come in with the assumption that somebody who is the Trump follower and you know, I'm not always right about this, they're usually not that one-dimensional, where they too have had the experience of feeling constrained by gender. And that's the kind of thing that I try to tap into with compassion. So I try to approach with that kind of compassion always, and you know, not assume that they disagree with me. But I think that the point that people, racists and sexists need to be held accountable is 100% spot on. And I, you know, especially people who are in power, they don't get a pass, and they don't just get to say and do whatever they want. And that's a completely different situation from you're hanging out with people playing D&D and discussing, you know, the meaning of things with each other. And that they're categorically different. And the responses to those things are, I think, are necessarily different.
Michael?
Only if no one else is ready to speak, because I already have
Could
spoken.
I just make a brief little follow-up at some point?
Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the important sort of values we've been talking about here, and is often a part of this conversation when we look back at feminism, is the sort of 60-odd years of working on the variety of appropriate ways to be a woman. There is not this one ideal that we all must live up to. But when we talk about masculinity, we still have this one ideal that, Tom, you were looking for, the sort of a definition of masculinity that doesn't just become general things that all human beings should be. We maybe shouldn't be looking for one definition of masculinity, but a diversity of appropriate ways to be a man. Just like there is a wide diversity of appropriate ways to be a woman that most girls can see as aspirational for them without being told, you shouldn't do this because a good woman would only be that. And it's that limitation, which I think might be part of the penalty of gender that, Shira, you were talking about. The limitation that this is the only appropriate way to be, as opposed to embracing a wide variety of possibilities. My concern, though, was that in that wide variety is also going to be the toxic forms, and it's hard to get those out of the picture without just doing it very, very slowly over several generations.
Yeah, that's.
Okay, so where's Ariel had a new question, but Michael, you wanted to follow up, and also Stephen wanted to follow up. So let's just get Michael your follow up, and then Stephen fairly quickly, and then we'll move on to Ariel.
Okay, I'll be quick. I agree entirely with what Shira and Sarah said about racism and not tolerating it. I think it's absolutely central. I do believe, however, that I very much want to know why the racist is racist. There's a man named Daryl Davis. He's a black soul singer. And what he does is that he actually goes and seeks out members of the KKK, and he befriends them. He befriends them. They bond over things. They talk. And over time, he begins to become curious. He wants to know, without any judgment, why do you feel the way you feel? Why do you hate me if you don't know me? And he doesn't judge them. He listens. And what happens is they develop a relationship. And through that relationship, they realize that this man is human and is like them. And they have actually given up their KKK robes. He has them in his closet. And so, if you will, I think, frankly, that what Tom is talking about with love, Michael, is the right thing. That to act out of love constantly is the right thing to do, while at the same time putting up a barrier that says, no, I will not tolerate this even so. Both of those things can happen at the same time, in my opinion.
And then Stephen, final follow-up?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent.
Hi, Stephen.
Hello. I just wanted to mention in terms of, I think Mason's point about how we've been able to round out and flesh out feminism to a great deal, but not masculinity. And it's definitely something that Raywyn Connell brings up that Shira mentioned during her presentation. And she points out the fact, and there are some other masculinity scholars that actually echo this point, that masculinity has been defined for centuries as that which is not feminine. And so when we talk about the idea that masculinity is not as fleshed out as feminism, that there's an argument or there's a discussion in men's studies about, is that purposeful? That if the only idea has been that masculinity is that which is not feminine, and that is used as the dividing line, then there has not been a reason to basically flesh out masculinity. And the idea that what's happening in men's studies in the last 40 or 50 years is something that's revolutionary, because it's It's the fact that masculinity hasn't defied definition. It's that what Connell would say is hegemonic masculinity has made it such that masculinity didn't need to be defined, that it was simply understood when you saw it, it was masculine. And if it didn't fit into that, then it was not. That's it.
Oh, that's really interesting, Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
We need better definitions of masculinity.
Sorry, Stephen, you mentioned a paper by Raywyn Connell. Do you know the title of that paper? I'd like to read that.
Well, the piece by Raywyn Connell I would recommend, and probably the most definitive piece by her is one that she wrote with James Messerschmidt called Hegemonic Masculinity, Rethinking the Concept. She originally created the idea of hegemonic masculinity, I think in the late 80s, and she got a lot of criticism for it. And instead of just pushing the criticism aside, she came back and said, okay, you know what? I'm going to answer my critics, and I'm going to actually evaluate my thinking on masculinity and reevaluate some of my thinking, and came up with an even more defined piece. I would highly recommend that piece in outlining not only what Connell was talking about prior to that piece, but how Connell grew in her overarching idea of masculinity.
Thank you.
I think your question, especially in the military context, is even more significant because it's so male, right? Like the military, the police, it's the way that it actually makes people who are in the military structure their lives, right? It enforces these kinds of misogynistic gender roles. So I think this is very similar to academics as well, right? So academics have to move a lot, right? So because of that, your partner, in some sense, has to give up a lot of their own independence and a lot of their life, and they become the primary caretaker of the person who is the academic or the person who is the military personnel. And that just seems to kind of enforce these gender roles, but then also it enforces a kind of resentment, perhaps, that could lead to that kind of thinking about women and their partners, which I think this is a great question. So, panel speakers, please. Would anyone want to speak to this?
And Stephen in the chat said he could speak to it very well.
I don't know about very well, but I can try. My dissertation was actually looking, applying some parts of Tom's theory to veterans who are in the university. So I did a lot of reading on military masculinity. One of the interesting things that's coming out of new critical masculinity theory is the idea that we refer to it as military masculinity, but everybody that walks through the door of the masculinity or walks through the door of the military is indoctrinated in this masculinity, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of whether they're women, men, or trans. They are taught that the way to operate in the military is through utilization of military masculinity. And one of the things that comes out of that is that what you see in the research is that women who go through the military, just like women in the police force, they adopt this very odd liminal space where they internalize the military masculinity, and they don't see it as in what you're fearing as like self-deprecation, but they are heavily critical of other women because of the fact that they have internalized this idea that I have a skill that you don't, and I can be closer to men than you are. And so they tend to be extremely critical of other women. And one of the things that came out of my research when I was looking at veterans, and one of the reasons that I focused on men, is because there's an embodiment of veteran as a male form, that women actually have to approach others and say, I'm a veteran, for someone to consider them a veteran, where if we see certain physical attributes of like the haircut, the stance, or wearing certain things, we would assume that certain men are veterans. But women don't have that same privilege. And so there was a piece by Sarah Boehmer that demonstrated how women in these roles sometimes overcompensate to show that I am someone who was in the military. So it's not so much about self-hate, but it's a propagation of military masculinity, even in spaces where military masculinity is not necessarily valued.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge pressure on them to be part of the pack, you know, to be. I mean, they're, especially when you're thinking about a cop. I mean, they're some cops, of course, are play roles that involve virtually no danger at all. But if a cop is involved in dangerous activity and dangerous situations, then their life can depend upon the bond that they have with other cops. And if that bond is premised on misogyny, and it's not unusual, it's not just among cops and people in the military that bonding occurs on the basis of misogyny often. I mean, for women, that is. In the business world, that happens too. There are women who, oh God, what was her name? Actually, her name was Ariel also, Ariel Levy, I think. Am I remembering that correctly? Can't remember the name of the book now, but she talks about, I think, men in the business world and women in the business world who go out with men to strip clubs and that sort of thing. And they engage in misogynistic taunts of the dancers and so on, along with the men, that there's this huge pressure, if they want to succeed in that environment, to act like a man. And acting like a man in that context means acting misogynistically. But it's not that they're ever fully accepted as, you know, as men. Of course, they're always women, but they can at least kind of, I don't know, reach a certain level of survival or something, or as a minimal acceptance or something like that, by acting out in misogyny. And I think it makes the men feel more comfortable with their misogyny. The woman can play the value of making the men more comfortable with their misogyny. Otherwise, they might feel ashamed or embarrassed about it. But if they see a woman doing it, then it's fine. It's kind of like a white guy who has a black friend who will laugh at their racist jokes and that sort of thing. That gives them a kind of reassurance that they're not racist, because their black friend laughs at their racist jokes, when their black friend, of course, is just trying to survive too, and trying to have some friends, you know, there may be a context where they need the professional contact or something, and so they, you know, play along. But it's tough.
I was just thinking, sorry, Tom.
No.
I was just thinking of, oh, my computer's about to die. I was just thinking of a story a friend recently told me about joining the Army and wanting to be in the military police. And in basic training, the very first sort of task assigned to him was to get rid of some other people from basic training that basically they didn't want to make it through. And his job was humiliating them until they quit, and doing things like pouring their canteens on their bed so they'd be in a wet bed all night, and urinating in their canteens so they'd have to drink urine during the day, and basically messing with their heads. And he did it because he didn't want to be the victim of it, and he did it because he wanted to be in the military police. And this humiliation and this ability to humiliate was part of the training and part of the test to see if he belonged.
Sure.
And it seems to me that this kind of insult of calling someone a dependa, it's like right in line with the training of what you're supposed to be able to do. That is a contiguous part of that. The violence is not just physical, but psychological, and
Right.
ability to control and manipulate. It seems like that's right in line with that militarized masculinity that we've been describing.
I hate to say this, but it sounds like maybe, you know, there's that the husband's masculinity is contingent to a certain extent on his wife's playing that role, the dependent role, in a way that is acceptable to the his male associates and so on. I mean, it's hard to, it's very painful to say that, but that's.
I think that there's this question, right, of like, how can we change that? How can deal with this kind of situation to make things, to improve things? I think one way, right, is this idea of, so we were talking about how masculinity, like how do we define masculinity? And I think that's an interesting question because we talk about protection, and it seems that this notion of protecting one's loved ones has become, what's the word, mutated, or, you know, kind of, it's become, it's become something violent, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be. And when you think about men and women, mothers and fathers, they all protect their children, right? So they all protect, like we protect the people we care about, and we do that in so many ways. So like when my mom, right, my loving mother, who I live with, she does my laundry because I'm so busy, right? Or she cooks me dinner because I'm so busy. I consider that a kind of protection, right? That's also kind of care. I think that you can flip that as well, right? So what men in the military and what police officers do can be also considered a type of care. But I think when you frame it as care, it might actually help them reorient the way that they respond to the people that they're caring for, right? So instead of it becoming a relationship of domination, right, it becomes a relationship of interaction and help and support, rather than, you know, I'm going to make you do something kind of way of understanding things. And I think it's interesting in terms of how everybody polices gender, right? Including women, because that just speaks to, I think, the effectiveness of community members, right? Speaking out against certain kinds of behavior. But then, like, why are we not speaking out against misogynistic behavior, right? Why is it that we're going the other direction? And yeah, it's because our history, right, culturally, is rooted in misogynistic tradition. But I think that doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. And I think the tides, right, are starting to turn, especially now also with people speaking out about racism and calling in as well, right? So I think what needs to happen to a certain extent is to provide community members, right, ways in which they could redirect the policing so that it becomes policing misogynistic behavior. With compassion, I think that's also necessary, because I do think another point about that Tom made that I thought was really great in his book is that, you know, misogyny makes it really, really difficult for men. Like it puts men in an extremely stressful position, right, of high anxiety. They're considered to be the caretakers. They are the ones who are the physical protectors, so on and so forth. And it puts them in situations where most of the time, right, given the state of our economy, right, given the state of, you know, the fact that we live in a capitalist society, that people are just going to fail at being a man in various ways throughout their life, right? So it's like, it just puts them in these really extremely difficult situations. And I think that in itself, right, needs to be recognized, but it also needs to be recognized that the blame then shouldn't be placed on their partner, right? It shouldn't be placed on women, but more so it's the conception of what a man is. That's the problem.
First of all, thank you for sharing your story. I know, I mean, it sounds like you probably had to tell it at 7 different places and within the military structure, and now you've told us again. And I appreciate you telling your story so that we can understand what you and your husband have gone through. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that. It's not uncommon, I think, in the military, in workplaces, in universities. And unfortunately, to Ariel's point, non-discrimination laws and anti-retaliation provisions, they're not preventative. They're not set up to prevent the behavior from happening, right? They're the things that they're the mechanisms we use to complain after it's happened. I mean, the point, I think, is that when it's happened enough, and then maybe it won't happen anymore. Like when we as a society can send a message that we will not tolerate discrimination on the basis of any protected status, that we will not tolerate retaliation against people who raise concerns about the ways that they've been treated. I mean, I think the hope would be that eventually those things stop happening, because as a society, we've changed what we will allow, we've changed what we will tolerate. But we're just obviously, we're not there. And we do have these protections, but again, they're reactive. They're reactionary measures as opposed to preventative measures. And and it wasn't just Ariel that was retaliated against, it was her husband. And it sounds like it's changed, something very personal that happened to Ariel has changed the entire trajectory of her husband's career. And that can definitely happen. I mean, retaliation is the #1 reason that I hear about that people don't want to come forward with reports of sexual assault, sexual harassment, discrimination based on sex, gender, and other protected statuses. And it's real. I don't know the answer to how we address that, but I do agree with Ariel that it is a problem. One of the biggest things that we do, I think, especially Title IX at universities, is provide the resources. I mean, Ariel talked a lot about the resources. Sometimes that's all we can do. If somebody doesn't want to make a report about their sexual assault or their sexual harassment, one of the things we can do that can help is to provide these resources. But sometimes those resources open you up to more harassment and discrimination, right? If you're a victim of sexual assault and the dean reaches out to your faculty and says, hey, please provide this person with extra time, or let them retake this test, sometimes they'll get further discrimination in that person's response to them seeking resources. And so it can sometimes feel like sort of an open-ended cycle.
I think your biggest tool is the story that you have told, which is compelling and heart-wrenching. And unfortunately, telling that story opens you up to the very reprisals that you're talking about.
I do think that's a really great benefit to a certain extent, because when I read your book, I finally understood, right, to a certain extent, why misogynistic men and feminists were basically talking past each other, right? Because they just didn't share the same fundamental framework to understand what the other party was talking about, right? So when a feminist, calls a misogynistic man a misogynist and says, criticizes them for being violent, for not showing their emotions and so forth, to me, I thought, oh, so what the misogynist is basically thinking is, you're just mad at me for being a man. They don't understand, right? The whole point that feminists are trying to make is, no, that's not how men need to be. That's not what makes a man, right, is that you can't empathize with people and you can't show care and concern, and you can be strong without necessarily having to be violent, right? But the idea that just didn't like couldn't get through, right, to someone with a misogynistic framework, it finally clicked for me, right? And I thought, oh, this is what like guys need to read this book, right? Because feminists have been trying to explain to men, right? Like explain to men what the problem is. Like, listen, here, this is what the problem is, right? With your misogyny, it is harming us, right? But this book, I think, was able to make the point from the perspective of not just why women have a problem with it, but why men should have a problem with it, right? Like the fact that misogyny is especially harmful for men as well, right? So it's just like, it's not just women who lose, it's men who lose too.
Absolutely.
So that's like one of the things that, yeah, I thought was really great. I think we should call it a session. Does anyone have any last thoughts or last comments or question that they would like to ask or make or say? No?
I will just say that I learned from all of you, and if asked, I could tell you exactly what it was. So this was a very rich session for me. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone, all the critics and Tom and our audience as well. I really appreciate everybody being here and joining and participating.